and a warm welcome to everybody to this session on where we stand with social inclusion in water climate adaptation, and then mostly the practical side of social inclusion. The session is organized by the Dutch government along with the World Bank Group and Deltares. We have a good array of speakers and it should be a rich discussion today. My name is Matthijs Selmans. I'm a program advisor at the Netherlands Enterprise Agency and I will be your host for this session. My co-host today is Stephanie Jansen from Deltares, who is, Hi
everybody.
Hi. You can ask her also questions in the chat if you would like. And today's goal is to understand on where we stand with practicing social inclusion. What are the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats in our current global practice? We will engage with experts to provide answers to these questions, and we will ask you, the audience, for your input as well. The input from this session will be used in a SWOT analysis, and that SWOT analysis is the basis for our second session, which is tomorrow at 1 on practical do's and don'ts for social inclusion in water climate adaptation. To introduce our first speaker of today, Maarten Giesler. He's a water advisor at the Netherlands Ministry for Foreign Affairs. He works on water and climate resilience at the scale of transboundary river basins, but also at the city scale. Maarten currently focuses on Africa and the Middle East. In the past, he has worked in Dakar, Palestina, the Caspian and Aral Sea areas, South Asia, and many other regions. Welcome, Maarten. Thanks for joining. And
Hi.
Hi. And to start off, what is social inclusion to you?
Well, I see social inclusion and exclusion as two sides of the same coin. And I think they're often the result of deliberate choices in society, not necessarily choices of those who are excluded, but choices of those in power. And that makes social inclusion more of a political than a technocratic goal, I would say. And it reflects often power differences in society. And that also makes it a very hard nut to crack. So I think we see that exclusion is often based on identity, ethnic identity, disability, political orientation, gender, geographic location, age, whatnot. And if identity determines whether or not a group can co-benefit from a development intervention, then that needs to inform the design of our interventions. Otherwise, however well-intended, our interventions may produce more exclusion and not less.
Thanks. So where do we, think about that, where do we as development partners currently stand with enabling social inclusion? So what is currently still challenging?
Well, I think we struggle a lot with the form versus function of inclusion. That is ticking the boxes versus really being aware and really seeing it. We tend to operate rather formulaic within a project cycle logic. You know, 1 cup of gender, 2 tablespoons of inclusion, a squeeze of climate adaptation, and an ounce of youth, and then we're good to go. And I think these ingredients are not always applied in a way that is relevant to the specific context. So our analysis is not always robust enough of these underlying power dynamics. And often we don't allow ourselves the time to figure out those local specifics. So finding the right balance between, quick wins and tangible results, which we need, and the sustained impact that remains as difficult now as it always was, I would say.
Certainly. So what I hear you saying is that our current approach may not always be sufficient. But on the other hand, do you have examples of approaches that you think work well in overcoming these challenges?
Well, maybe a meta example from my own organization on integrating inclusion into our programs better. And I like that term, integrating, better than mainstreaming. In my own ministry, we had an inclusion task force for a while, dedicated staff who were working alongside our more technical teams to help us consciously integrate inclusion in our interventions. And I think that really made a difference because, professionals like myself who are not experts in inclusion, we need hand-holding from experts in inclusion. It is multidisciplinary work. And I felt that, we made good progress, and then unfortunately, mission achieved was announced a bit too early to my taste. So that task force is no longer there. And I think we could have come further if it had been sustained for a longer period of time. A more operational example of inclusion, which I always like, and Sarah, who's in this session, knows that. It's a study the World Bank did on village democracy in India and the deliberative inequality in the village dialogues. And the study analyzed word by word the formal biannual dialogues between government representatives and villagers in 250 villages. And so it spelled out what were the main topics that concerned the citizens, who speaks and how much, who participates, who sets the agenda, how do officials respond to the villagers. And that paints a very fascinating picture, first of all, of how important water and sanitation issues are for local democracy, but also a fascinating picture of the mechanics of exclusion based on gender. But the study also reveals how conscious and simple design interventions in the organization of the dialogue can turn them into inclusive events. So it really means that the quality of participation is important, not necessarily the numbers of so many women and so many men participated. It's really quality that matters: who speaks, who doesn't, who raises the relevant points, who gets a relevant response, who gets ignored or dissed, etc.
So it's the quality and the contents of the meeting. So thinking about this, what are opportunities we can use for enabling social inclusion?
Well, because it is a political issue, it also needs time. And, time is something that we are always notoriously short of as development partners. But the good news is that we have the 2030 agenda. So that is 10 years to go. That's maybe not enough, but it's much longer than the typical project cycle. So the opportunity I see is, develop programs with a 2030 horizon, expand ongoing interventions to that date. If prospects for results are good, take the time to get to grips with the local dynamics of inclusion and exclusion, and also mobilize the relevant expertise. Design your intervention relevant to context, and then, stay the course.
Fully agree with that. And that actually sounds like a great opportunity for enabling and improving social inclusion. So as we're running out of time, as any last words, what can we actually do when working abroad?
I think do not shy away from dialogue about the political nature of inclusion, exclusion. It plays at all levels: river basin, a city, a village, you name it. It's not accidental exclusion. And one of my favorite programs that makes these dynamics explicit is the field level leadership program. It builds on the professional integrity of the rank and file in, for instance, a water utility. And it empowers them to do the best possible job, deliver the best possible services to citizens. And, in our capacity building programs, we often focus on technical skills. This program invests in the motivation of professionals to do their job in the best possible way. And, you know, there's always talented staff, if only their potential gets unlocked. And FLL has a formula that unlocks that. And I think that is a much better basis for development than sending in another busload of consultants, I think. You know, when those with professional integrity get more influence, organizational performance will start to improve, and, you know, results can be spectacular in many cases. Tomorrow, Wednesday at 1, we'll have a session in which we discuss this program. So don't miss it. Values as the spark.
Looking forward to it. Thanks, Marta. I think the point of stimulating and utilizing local talents, a highly important one, because in the end, it's not about us, it's about them. So thanks for this point. I think you've done a great job of setting the scene for the session today. So moving on to our second part, which is an audience poll. We'd like to ask you, the audience, for what are strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. Actually, what goes well, what doesn't go well in our current approach with enabling social inclusion. For this, our co-host Stephanie will give a brief explanation on how to do this.
Yes, we're going to use a Menti, and we're very curious to learn. We have a large group today of, I see now 77 participants. So we're really curious to hear what's your experience and what do you see where we are with social inclusion. I'm going to share my screen and invite you to look into the to go to www.menti.com and then use the code that is listed here on top of the screen. And to get to see who is in the room, we'd like to know where you are, and if you're able to pin this on the image that is presented here, so we know where everybody is calling in from. We have a first one, I see, which is great. It means that still many people located in Europe or Western Europe, maybe. Hey, we have Australia, Indonesia. Wow. South Africa. I'm almost sure we also have somebody from Canada. Sarah, at least. UK, a lot Western Europe. So thanks for sharing. Thanks for a lot for sharing where you are. Makes a really nice picture, right? Still people are making their submissions. I'm also going to move to the next screen to get your input on the question we have. Already Matthijs said we'd like to sort of investigate where we are with social inclusion, and we have now 2 questions for you. What goes well with social inclusion in practice? And we use the sort of this word cloud, because otherwise it's not able to put all the almost 80 people's input in there. So we hope that we can make, you can put in 1 or 2 words, and then we see it appearing on the screen. So please tell us, what do you see, what's going well with social inclusion in practice? We already heard the example from Maarten, that about of not only focusing capacity building on the technical side, but also on the more people side. What's going well? Is it put as a priority? Meetings, high-level discussion, social justice. If you like one of the words that are here, you can add it again, and then it becomes more prominent in the word cloud. So we have engagement, equality, durability. communication, time, and transparency is now being highlighted. Time, I like that perspective of you, Maarten, 2030. We have to act now, but at least that gives, provide indeed an opportunity. Transparency, understanding the costs.
Stephanie?
Yeah.
I'm not sure, but I'm not seeing the results. So I don't know if I'm the only one.
Do others see the results?
No, same here.
Oh,
I just
neither do I.
wanted to-
Oh, so you
No,
only
we
listen
still-
to me talking.
Yes.
Sorry. Oh, wait. You're, wait a minute. I'm gonna start. Thank you for sharing this, because let's see how it works now.
Yes.
We can-
Okay,
right.
tell me again if something happens. Okay, now, so here you can take a look at the word clouds, the communication, transparency, the things that are being highlighted. And if you think something else needs to be highlighted, please do so. I also see a priority, participation. Okay, the second question we have for you, you can already expect that one, see that one coming now, is what needs improvement with social inclusion in practice. So you have now gave some input on what goes well, but yeah, there are also still challenges. Otherwise, we would not have to have this session today. Working youth participation, involvement in the decision, reaching everyone, budgets, changes on the ground. Yeah, that resonates with what we hope to discuss also today at a really actual practice. If you like one of the terms, put it in again, and then it gets highlighted. Youth participation, listening. How are we youth participating today? Yeah, that's always. Unfortunately, I cannot consider myself youth anymore, but it is a really valid point. How inclusive are we in talking about inclusion? Listening, one of the challenges, intersectional approach. We're going to leave it up to here, Matthijs. I'm going to stop sharing the screen. And I'm going to leave you to the next of the projects. Everybody, thank you very much for making your contributions.
Yeah, thanks indeed, everybody. And I think these are all valuable inputs. After the session, we will analyze this a little bit more and actually try to make a SWOT analysis about this that we can use for as a starting point for our session tomorrow. To try to go a little bit deeper into the content, we will try to establish where we stand by listening to 2 case presentations. Our first presentation is by Sarah Keener. Sarah works at the World Bank Water Global Practice and leads the social inclusion agenda in water at the World Bank. She has worked for 25 years on issues of inclusion and social accountability in Africa, Middle East, and Latin America and Caribbean regions of the World Bank. She's currently undertaking a stock take on how citizens' voice can be amplified in planning responses and solutions to climate change in water. So welcome, Sarah, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Let me see if you can see my screen.
We can, if you could just make it a full screen. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Okay, thank you very much, Mats, for this really interesting introduction discussion. We know that enhancing citizen voice is important in addressing the unequal impacts of climate adaptation and climate change. And so we often focus on citizen engagement or voice and participation at the community level, most typically around setting development priorities. But the reality of water as a shared resource is that it flows across political boundaries. Achieving results often requires actions at the river basin or watershed level, which go beyond any one community. And we also know that as decisions get aggregated upwards, existing incentive and power systems are important, And the very nature of exclusion means that marginalized groups are often who are most affected by this tend to have less voice. So for example, while indigenous populations hold 20% of the world's land and 1/3 to 1/2 of communal lands, they only hold 10% of legal title to those lands. So how are they going to have an effective voice in decision-making, particularly at the scale required for dealing with climate change and climate adaptation? So similarly, while women suffer greater income loss from flooding, we know that they are not well represented in flood committees. So what can we learn from mechanisms that might close the gap between the intention to be inclusive in adapting to climate change and water and the actual result, particularly at scale? In answering the question, I want to draw from a case in New York City. It might seem a little bit far-fetched from our discussion, but just bear with me, because I think it's an interesting example of how do you try to amplify influence of less powerful groups. And it requires really looking at the detail of how this is done. So in New York City, at what's called Ground Zero, or the site where the Twin Towers existed before 9/11, when they went to redevelop this site or to rebuild it, it's one of the most, prime areas of real estate probably in the world. So talk about, powerful stakeholders in deciding what it had to do with it. You had one group of people who were most affected or most acutely affected, meaning the residents within that neighborhood and victims' families. But then you had, on the other hand, the land which was actually owned by the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, and the use of that land, the sort of vertical space, which was leased by a powerful real estate developer whose primary objective was to maximize quickly rebuilding office space. So in the middle of this decision-making process on how to redevelop this land, what to do with it among these competing interests, came the Regional Plan Association of New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut. This is a civic organization that represents the interests of about 23 million, to talk about scale, citizens across political boundaries of 3 states. They developed a coalition of 85 different civic, business groups, universities, and labor, and developed a listening to a city event using technology and small group discussions, as well as quantitative analysis, to have a really engaged and substantive debate on what to do. One note about this organization is it's been in existence for a long time. It's established relationships, and it has an analytical depth, not only to gather together this coalition, but to do the type of analysis that showed where are more vulnerable groups and having the data to back that up. So they organized one of the largest participatory processes, I think, in New York history. They brought together almost 5,000 people in having 10-person group discussions to have a really quality discussion on what the different options were being developed for that site, and to discuss the trade-offs. But perhaps most importantly, rather than having just an open forum, which might have favored more organized groups coming in, they used census data to invite ordinary citizens representative of the actual demographic, including different socioeconomic groups. And they also provided for a larger proportion of those who are more directly affected, victims, families, and residents in the specific area, so that their voices were adequately heard. But because they recognize that participation is an interactive process, it's not just about saying, what do you want? It's about how do you negotiate some consensus among, think about the scale of this. They also used a technique where people at individual tables, having individual focus groups, could see in real time via an electronic interface quantitative polling on what others were doing and feedback on what was going on at the other tables. And that facilitated understanding overall views and the type of interaction, iterative interaction, which is important. So by combining the best of statistically representative data, which gave more weight to the results vis-a-vis others, and this qualitative, really substantive engagement to going into the details and making sure people really understood and had the information to make an informed decision or feedback, they were able to have an impact. And in the end, and I think this is perhaps the first time ever, at this very meeting, the planning commissioner tore up the 6 proposals and essentially said, we're going to revise the entire proposal based on the feedback they've gotten from this. So it was one example of actually being able to counteract some very powerful interests and better represent voice. A second example, which I want to just very briefly touch upon, shows how we might close the gap again between intention and outcomes, and comes from Palestine. In Palestine, GIZ, together with the Municipal Development Lending Fund and the World Bank and others, set out to have a participatory municipal investment plan process that would be more inclusive of women, youth, and other marginalized groups. But rather than just have the process, what they did was to systematically and in a statistically significant way, check feedback from citizens themselves and publish this feedback. They looked at not only satisfaction with services, but what was the quality of the participatory process? Was there discrimination in service access? And what was the evolution of the level of trust in government? They didn't just do this once, they did it on a repeated basis over time. So this became a management tool for them to understand what was the quality of their participation. And they also looked at towns that had not used the same process so they could distinguish what was an influence from that process versus what was going on in the overall environment. So what does this mean for our discussion on inclusion in climate adaptation in water, and where do we stand? We know that climate adaptation in water involves numerous decisions that will have impact on excluded groups and will be translated through existing incentive structures. So for example, one government official may prefer a seawall, which involves tangible contracts and a physical accomplishment to a nature-based solutions. But a conscious effort is needed to think through how these decisions are going to be made and how you're going to represent these other points of view and have a really meaningful discussion. We also know that that effective participatory mechanisms recognize and devise strategies and iterative processes to address the complexity of this process. It's not easy to get consensus. You have to think about what is the process of aggregating upwards? How is that going to be reported back? And how, what are the mechanisms to rebalance the lack of voice for those who are most affected by these things? And also to systematically monitor feedback on the process and its degree of inclusion. But when we come to where do we stand on climate adaptation on these types of processes, there is no one stock take. We're starting to do one. If other knows of one, that'd be great to know. But it's pretty clear there's a lot of work on sort of community level engagement on resilience. There's a lot of work on citizen science. But we still need much more civic analysis, civic organizations like the RPA, who are filling in that middle ground, and that middle ground where we look at how do you do this at scale? How do you have the discussion at the watershed level or at the basin level, not just at the community level? And how can we amplify that voice? Going into the details of what those mechanisms are is essential, I think, for us moving forward on this agenda. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sarah. I think you've made some excellent and highly important points for our discussion today and the discussion in general on enabling social inclusion. So thank you for that. For our second presentation, I would like to welcome Dr. Stephanie Jansen, Stephanie Jansen works as a specialist in the field of social inclusion and sustainability and water climate adaptation, among others through nature-based solutions implementations. She works for the Dutch Knowledge Institute Deltaris, and where she is lead of the Sustainability Research Program. Stephanie is also the manager of the Community of Practice Social Inclusion in the Dutch International Water Climate Adaptation. So welcome, Stephanie.
Thank you, Matthijs.
And the floor is yours.
I again try to share my screen. If something strange happens, let me know. Yes, thank you very much for the invitation. And I'm going to share, I'm going to try to reflect also on the question you asked, where are we with social inclusion? And I'm going to make a report on how we, with a network of Dutch organizations, have been working on social inclusion, and what do we see, what's happening. As a first introduction, the Dutch water sector is very active internationally, and you see that in many countries in the world, the Dutch organization and also the Dutch government makes a contribution to water strategies. Here you see a few examples of work that's been done in Ho Chi Minh City, but also in Bangladesh on the Delta Plan. There was work on Dutch contributions in Jakarta, Indonesia, and the Philippines, in Mozambique. So what we see is that the Dutch knowledge travels abroad. A few years ago, comments were heard on the efforts made. So what happened is that in some of these projects, the critical reports were published, specifically related to social inclusion, are not being inclusive enough. There were also conferences where this topic was starting to be discussed. There are a range of very interesting publications that I would like to recommend you, by Shanur Hassan, by Ellen Minkman, and also Lizzie Arena, specifically reflecting on this topic. And there was a Dutch policy evaluation. And the comments that were being heard is that were related to the connection of Dutch knowledge related to local context, of understanding this local context and the impact there is on a range of diversity of groups, on the participation and representation during project development and the use of local knowledge. And so these are comments that were being addressed, and that's so that's what happened. But at the same time, we saw that all our Dutch organizations were trying to tackle this and see how we can improve on it. Here are a few examples of organizations: a working paper on social inclusion and a social inclusive infra manual. But what we saw is that social inclusion cannot be tackled by individual organizations. So there's the consultant who tries to do his best, but who gets an assignment. There's the government who needs to make, who's depending on the consultant to do the work route. You have the NGOs who have the community expertise and the community network, and their academia who do the research. So we felt if we can work, we need to work together to tackle it in a very good way. Also, we felt that there was a lack of understanding among the different parties involved. So we had to see how this can be more a collaborative effort. 2 years ago, knowing this, knowing that is a topic we want to improve on and we cannot do it alone, we initiated a community of practice on social inclusion. We started early 2020, and our ambition was to learn from practice. So really understand what's happening in practice. What are the insights that we can gain from that? And how can we translate that into practical approaches that improve social inclusion in the international efforts that are there? I mean, working so much internationally also is a great opportunity. If you can do it right, you can have so much positive impact. The community of practice is at the moment a network of about 20 organizations, and we have different government authorities, we have NGOs, consultants, a contractor, and knowledge institutions. And we try to work as a working group and to really get to know each other, build trust, and see how we can tackle this. And our view is that the ownership of the community is with the participants. So how do we work on this topic? What's our approach? We do a range of things, but the basis is learning from practice and learning from case studies. So what we do is we select the Dutch intervention and we try to deeply understand it. We don't judge, we listen to all the different stakeholders, and we try to be as inclusive as possible when listening to all the different perspectives. What you see, everybody wants to improve it, but sometimes we together create outcomes we don't want. So how can we need to understand what's happening and to see how we can improve collectively. And based on this deep understanding, we develop insights and see how we can move to action. So far, we have 3 case studies. So in October of 2020, we looked into the Manila-based Sustainable Development Master Plan with Dutch involvement in the Philippines. There was a project. We have a program, Water as Leverage for Resilient Cities in Asia. So that was in April, and we're now preparing understand the case study of the long-term involvement of the Netherlands in the city of Beira and Mozambique. I'm going to shortly tell you how what happens in these in learning from these case studies. So the first one was the Manila Bay Sustainable Development Master Plan with Dutch involvement in a very very large area with many people, stakeholders, and with huge problems. And in this project, the Dutch government specifically said, can we improve, how can we include people participation and social inclusion? And what we saw is that, that participation grew, but also that it was a very challenging situation. So during our effort, we try to listen to all the different perspectives and understand what happens and generate insights based on that. Based on this effort, different people in our community of practice starting to work on specific topics. So what you see is that we have the insight from the case, and there was a conclusion. Okay, we need to act on specific topics. Here to give you an example of where people started to find each other, also in this network. It gave an opportunity to reach out to your colleagues in the field. So we work. There are people working on improving social inclusion in terms of references, on capturing the lessons from this Manila Bay effort, on improving stakeholder engagement instruments at very practical level. I mean, we have all the literature on it, but how it happens in practice. One of my colleagues, he said, basically we try to really avoid mistakes. So we try to do our best, but the practice is very hard. So how can we improve and help each other? So this is what happened after generating these insights. The second case we took was a program, the Water as Leverage program, who aimed for improving resilience in 3 cities in Asia. What was very interesting is in this program, deliberately had an ambition for being socially inclusive. So yeah, we were super happy to use this case and to see what can we learn about social inclusion from this effort, and so how can we learn, what insights does it generate? And to briefly tell you what we learned, and we've also here. So is that that to enable social inclusion, you need to look at 3 perspectives. You have of course, the community engagement. That is like the obvious one, to have local presence and a proactive inclusion of vulnerable communities. So that is one of the lessons learned, but there's also the other perspective, being inclusive in your program development, looking at your teams, multidisciplinary with different people, including youth, but also having designers and architects and local people. So that is among others, that perspective, and also the inclusive commissioning. You need that to work in a social inclusive manner. For example, as a commissioner, being flexible, because if you truly listen to what happens on the ground, to the different people, you cannot stick to the idea you had. For example, your plan was to build a bridge, but when you ask the people on the ground, there needs to be another solution. As a commissioner, flexibility is key to an inclusive approach. So these are the lessons we gained from that. So to sum up, because we're going to the end, is that I feel that in the way we work as social inclusion is very high on the agenda. Nobody can do it alone, and everybody I talk to, people care about it. They want to do it right. In the community practice, we work on deeply understanding how it works in practice, and so far we've generated many insights of the challenges there are, but also saw very interesting best practices. We're working on publications where we summarize the results, and it very much helped among our organizations to much understand it. And I didn't mention it, but in our meetings, we try to be as inclusive as possible to have the different perspective. We work on network building, and we explore and develop inclusive approaches. If you'd like to learn more, this was a very brief overview, but we have had also another video made and a podcast for people that are interested. And if you'd like to learn more or have questions or feedback, please get in touch.
Thank you, Stephanie, for the great presentation. I think both you and Sarah made excellent points on accountability, on different incentives of different players, how to actually use the feedback you get from community engagement, but also the different perspectives of social inclusion, such as it's not just about community engagement, it's also about how you act as a commissioner, how you design programs, and the entire process of development cooperation. So thank you for that. I would like to move on to our panel discussion. We have 3 panelists, which I will introduce, who I will ask to reflect. So our first panel member is Shelley McMillan. Shelley is a senior water resource management specialist in the Sustainable Development Division of the World Bank Group. She is the team leader of the water portfolio in Myanmar, Cambodia, Laos, and Thailand, and is the focal point for the Mekong River Basin. Her expertise includes many aspects such as transboundary water resource management, bulk water infrastructure, and she also works on institutional strengthening and hydroinformatics. So Shelley, welcome. Our second panel member is Dr. Jayshree Venkatesan. Jayshree has a PhD in biodiversity and biotechnology and has many years experience with issues like conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity and ecological restoration, with a special interest in urban wetlands. And she is currently the managing trustee of the Care Earth Foundation in India and was part of the Water as Leverage team in Chennai. So a very warm welcome to you, Jayshree.
Thank you.
And finally, our third panel member is Michel Tonneijk. Michel is a civil engineer, a dike and river expert in the Netherlands. He's worked for the government until 2007 and since then as a consultant for Royal Haskoning DHV. And since 2010, he has worked internationally in delta planning projects in the Netherlands, Vietnam, Cambodia, Myanmar, Indonesia, Senegal, and Benin. So welcome to you all. So I will ask each of you a question in turn, and then you can reflect on each other. So start with you, Shelley. Based on your experience and what you've heard today, what can you say about where we stand with social inclusion and maybe what are opportunities and threats in our current approach?
Thanks, Matthias, and thanks everybody. So I think we had a really good set of presentations and ideas. You know, reflecting on what I heard, from my perspective, I really think that behavior change is at the heart of climate change. So in that sense, I see that, you know, inclusion and social inclusion, as we're calling it, is really an imperative if we want to successfully deal with climate change. Probably most of you may already know that the World Bank has just completed a new climate change action plan. And that is going to be a pretty big paradigm shift for us, right? Because we want to now have our lending increase to about 50 billion over the next 5 years for climate change adaptation. So we're going to move from what we would say would be investing in green projects to actually trying to green economies. So when I think about what Martin said, and even what Sarah and Stephanie was saying, that necessarily is going to require us to design our projects quite differently, of course, in close collaboration with our clients, but using much more inclusive processes and to include much more inclusive decision-making towards, you know, trying to achieve this goal. I have to say that, you know, we are trying, but it is a work in progress. So, you know, we're already seeing, I would say, quite good improvements in relation to women, people with disabilities, and other vulnerable groups being much more included in some of our development work, but there is still a way to go. And I just had one thought on the threats. And personally, I see that the COVID-19 pandemic is a possible threat. In some cases, I think working in this virtual way, like we're doing today, has led to improvements in inclusion. And seaweed is a very good example, right? Many more people all around the world can connect to, but it's also resulted in exclusion. And if I think of child education, that's an example of where we've seen a lot of inclusion. Finally, I do think that the pandemic in the post-recovery phase is going to result in a rush to economic growth, right? And countries are going to want to go back to those pre-pandemic levels of growth. And that possibly could also lead to exclusion rather than inclusion as we race to try and restore those economic growth trajectories. I stop there.
All right, thanks, Shelley. I think very valid points. Thank you. Moving on to you, Jayshree. The second question, or the same question for you. Where do you think we stand with enabling social inclusion, and what may be opportunities and threats in our current situation?
Thank you, Matthias. I think the fact that we have a near unanimous global consensus on the importance of social inclusion in any work that we undertake is a big opportunity that I see. This was not the case a few years ago. As somebody earlier mentioned, we had busloads or sometimes even plane loads of consultants dropping onto at least landscapes where I live and advising us on what to do, thereby resulting in much more fragmentation than what was earlier existed. This is an opportunity that I think is very, very welcome. The second opportunity that I see is the kind of pragmatism that's come in, rather than talking about unreasonable deadlines. We are now very clear that this social inclusion requires a lot of time. In fact, I would call it dogged determination combined with good amount of time. So we set reasonable targets. That's the second thing that I see as an opportunity. The third opportunity that I see actually comes from the ground, from the grassroots, where there has been a lot of social mobility. Gone are those days when people took whatever was thrown at them. These days we hear people questioning whatever intervention that we suggest or the recommendations that we make, and that is a very welcome change that I see. And if we assume that this kind of questioning and mobility is restricted to only the youth, we are wrong. Even the senior citizens these days are quite adept at challenging whatever ideas we have with a fair amount of data backup. So that is something that I see as an opportunity. The biggest threat I see is the historical burden that we still have. History has not been very kind to many of the marginalized groups. Certain kinds of issues that are typical to India, I'm sure are also typical to many other parts of the world. This burden, to break those shackles, is a big threat in the sense that we still are not very close to breaking them. So that is something that I see as a threat. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jayshree, also for your local perspective. And moving on finally to you, Michelle. From your experience as a consultant working abroad, the same question for you. Where do you see that we stand with enabling social inclusion, and what are opportunities and threats?
Okay, thank you, Matthijs. Sometimes I regard the discussion we make now on social inclusion a bit to when I started working in the Netherlands on dike restoration, dike rehabilitation, and river management. It was back in the 90s of last century when, in fact, we did still not do environmental impact assessments for waterworks that were so important to our country. And in fact, everybody was very much convinced that environmental impact was really an important issue by then. So we slowly started to incorporate that into our projects, but still the objective of the project, the primary objective of the project, was still the part of infrastructure. Later, we had very important discussions on what is the primary objective of this project. Is it infrastructure and environmental impact is just an impact that needs to be mitigated somehow, or is the environment an equally important objective for the project as the infrastructure itself? So I think that moving on and social inclusion becomes more important. Also, we have this discussion. Is it just an infrastructure project, or is it also is social inclusion an important primary objective as well. And I often give the example, working in Benin for now, I see a project of what they call Contournement Nord in Cotonou. It's a big road, in fact, connecting Nigeria to Togo through the town of Cotonou, which they're working on for 20-25 years already. But it remains an infrastructure project where, in fact, the city is so full. Social impact is in fact the most important issue there. So is it not a town rehabilitation project rather than a road project? So I think that's somehow my definition where we are.
Okay, thank you, Michel. I would like to actually open the floor to the three of you to reflect on what was said, or reflect on each other, if you'd like.
Maybe I can come in, Matthias.
Yeah, sure. Thanks.
Thanks. Yeah. You know, I'm an engineer by training. I did my postgraduate work in environmental policy and management. And I've spent most of my career sort of working on pretty large infrastructure projects in the water sector. But I think it's, you know, it's really imperative for us to sort of remain open and listen to, you know, lots of ideas coming from multiple disciplines. And I really feel that, you know, there's probably no more greater moment than now for us to really make more deliberate efforts to look at the way we structure our teams in the sector and how we design our projects right from the get-go, when we're thinking about, you know, just the seed of the idea and then bringing it to fruition. I do, as I said, think that we are trying to do that, you know, much better at the World Bank. But, you know, project managers like myself, you know, we're not trained in this sort of thing. So thankfully, you know, there are colleagues like Sarah and others to whom we can reach out to and bring them into the team and into the project design and so on, and really help us explore all of the options in terms of how we want to achieve the development impacts that we want to see on the other side. So I think, you know, that's really, and I guess that's what Stephanie was calling, you know, that middle box that she had on how we approach this subject. I think, yeah, that's something that we probably have to unpack a bit, and a lot that can be done in that space. Thanks.
Thank you, Shelley. I think there's a lot of overlap also with what was said in the other presentations. Jayshree and Michel, would you like to respond?
Yeah, Jayshree here. A small intervention. This was a very enriching discussion, and there were so many perspectives to it. I think this also gives us the kind of an opportunity, and in fact, it gives us the mandate to collaborate further on this. I think we've now reached a point where, as a global community, we need to collaborate, co-opt, and make sure that whatever we believe in and whatever we want to practice actually gets translated on ground. I think we've reached that point, and if we fall short of that now, I'm not very sure about what kind of a future we would be actually looking onto, you know, given the fact that we are all now coming through or coming out of a kind of a very grave situation. I think this is also something that we need to remind ourselves about. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I do fully agree that now is the time to act. And therefore, it's also great to see all these different perspectives coming together, and also such a large audience coming to this session. Michel, do you have any last words before we close the session?
Yes, I liked what Shelley said about reaching out to Sarah, because it's on our level. You always have to reflect on what can you do on your level to make things better. And well, obviously, when you work in the World Bank, you're more on the designer side of the project, and we, as a consultant, are more on the receiver side. But when offering a project to a client, to World Bank, to our government, whatever, I think we should better introduce a sort of appreciation paragraph of how do we look at the project? How do we look at the goals you set? And how can we contribute to also what are not really the primary goals?
So do you mean then also things like eventual impact and outcome on sustainability? Is that what you mean?
Exactly.
Right. I agree. Thanks a lot. We're in the last 3 minutes of the session. I think we will close it off here. I think there are many valuable inputs from both the audience and all the different speakers. We've heard about Manila, India, the US, and all these different places, and that's very nice to hear a comparison between all these different approaches. And I'm happy also to hear that there is a lot of overlap in the opinion of where we stand on social inclusion, namely that we do need to start redesigning the way we develop projects right from the get-go, and the way we develop programs right from the get-go. And another conclusion is that we cannot do it alone. We need to collaborate in partnerships also from the start, and with partners from different sectors as well. That input will be used to create a quick SWOT diagram, which will be used as the starting point for our second session tomorrow at 1. So if you'd like to hear more on actual practical do's and don'ts when working in the field, please join in. I want to thank the presenters, panel members, and of course the audience for your vital input on this important matter. One thing we know for sure is that social inclusion is on the agenda, and we are all willing to do something about it. So let's act. And that is why it is also great to hear so many different perspectives here today. And on that note, I am closing the session and hope to see you all again tomorrow. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Matthijs. Thank you all.
Thanks.
Thank you. Bye.